project partners and 3 from experts in the field. And the idea was to host this side event at this conference to bring together different communities of scientists, modelers and climate experts with biomass scientists, to both learn the preliminary and almost final results from the project, and also to exchange with the biomass experts. And the feedback of the hope is that the feedback of today's event will serve also as inputs and for the final shaping of the final results of this project, which ends next year in May, I think. So after this introduction, I think we can go straight to the point. I would like to introduce our project coordinator, Kati Koponen from VTT Finland, with the first presentation about quantifying and deploying responsible negative emissions. So the views and preliminary results from NEGEM project. And Kati, thank you. And by the way, I would like to thank you and all the speakers for being here. So let's start. We are also online. We have a few attendees online also. The event will be recorded, and possibly some of the presentations will be available after the event on the website for further dissemination. Feel free to interact. We should have enough time for questions after the presentations and at the end. Thank you. And Kati, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Maurizio, and welcome from my behalf as well for everyone. And it's nice to see you here. It's my first face-to-face presentation for a very long time, so it's quite exciting. And I want to also thank our speakers who were invited and accepted to come to join our workshop. So as said, VTT is coordinating NEGEM project, and we are studying the responsible negative emissions. So here you can see NEGEM consortium. We are 16 partners from 11 countries, 16 excellent partners, and 5 industrial partners included. The project started in June 2020, and it will last for 1 more year, as Maurizio said. So this workshop is very timely to feed into our final conclusions. And why we have a project like this? As we know, keeping the global warming below 1.5 or 2 degrees requires very drastic emission reductions. So we need to do anyway all the mitigation actions possible. But in addition to that, we will also need carbon dioxide removals. And here in the newest IPCC AR6 report scenarios, you see this need for the negative emissions or carbon dioxide removals. However, in these IPCC scenarios, the need for carbon dioxide removal is demand-based. So we put the models at a target to reach certain temperature level, and then they show us how much CDR we will need in addition to the mitigation measures. And the objective of NEGEM project is to analyze the realistic potential for CDR. So when we take into account the technical, commercial, environmental, and social restrictions, what would be the realistic potential for these solutions? And then how could we then meet this realistic potential? So how could the country portfolios look like? What are the EU-wide potentials? And what would be the enabling governing frameworks? So it's a very multidisciplinary project. And carbon dioxide removals can be done in many ways. In NEGEM, we study all of these, but in today's workshop, we focus on the biomass-based solutions. And often we divide these to nature-based solutions, such as reforestation, afforestation, and soil carbon sequestration. And then on the technical solutions, such as bioenergy combined with carbon capture and storage, BECCS, or biochar production, so where the biochar product from pyrolysis is used as a soil amendment. So as said, we know that we will need these technologies to ensure the planetary boundary for climate change, but at the same time, we know also that some of these measures may put pressures on other planetary or regional boundaries. And this we need to take into account in the decision making. When we look a bit closer to these IPCC scenarios for 2050 and 2100, we can see how much need for BECCS and removal on managed land is shown there. So there is a high variation between the scenarios, but anyway, substantial amounts of these CDR emission reductions or the emission removals are needed. And then I wanted to show the current levels of deployment. So here you see we have a little bit of BECCS, we have a little bit of biochar, and we have some traditional land management. So we have some afforestation and reforestation already taking place. But the scales are in BECCS and biochar in megatons, and we talk about the need of gigatons. I also marked the size of the voluntary carbon market here. So it's maybe something like this. I saw this evaluation or estimation, and it really shows that we are really in the beginning of the story of these carbon dioxide removal solutions. So I have listed some key questions here that we hope to discuss in today's workshop as well, and what we are studying in NEGEM project. So one of the key questions, we already discussed this in the opening session today. So how much land and sustainable biomass there is available when we consider the possible trade-offs with food production and the planetary boundaries, except, for example, for water and biosphere integrity and biodiversity. How to do BECCS right. So if we have limited biomass resources, where to use them most efficiently. We should use residues, follow the cascading principles, and also do bio-CCS. So we could capture biogenic CO2 from existing and future point sources of biogenic CO2. So we will hear today about the potential of biochar and its co-benefits. And then we all know that nature-based solutions can have a lot of co-benefits, for example, for forest and soil, but there are also risks related. So there is the risk of CO2 release. There are long time frames for forest growth, and there could be significant non-greenhouse gas climate impacts related, such as the question of albedo. And also in NEGEM, we touched the social license to operate for these different CDR solutions. So what is the acceptance of storing CO2 on or offshore? What is the acceptance of bioenergy and BECCS? And how people take, for example, the landscape impacts of reforestation and afforestation. So we are approaching these questions with various modeling tools and with social analysis. One of the key tools used in NEGEM is life cycle assessments to assess the side effects and trade-offs of different carbon dioxide removal methods. So our colleagues from ETH Zurich have performed an LCA of a full set of CDR methods. And I have highlighted here the biomass-based ones, so afforestation, reforestation, harvested wood products, biochar, and also algae cultivation and sinking, and then the different BECCS options. And I won't go in detail in the results, you can find them from the publications, but here you can see the green is good and red is bad. So all of these are good for the impact category of global warming, but most of them have also some trade-offs. So they have studied the impacts on human health, ecosystems, and fossil resources. Then in the NEGEM, several other modeling tools are used. So we are using biosphere model LPJML. So to provide supply constraint analysis of CDR potentials, and Constanze Werner will present you more about this. Then we are using MONE EU tool for cost optimization and studying the CDR efficiencies and the EU portfolios, and Nixon Sunny will present you more about that. And now at the end of the project, the results from these modeling studies will feed into VTT times model, which we will use to study 1.5 degree scenarios with different storylines and see what kind of global and EU portfolio of these CDR methods will come out of that. And as said, we are also studying the social impact. So a study on stakeholder perception has been made for NGOs and for private sector actors. And I took some examples of the results, and the results show that the NGOs have most favorable attitudes towards the nature-based solutions, whereas the private sector is also more in favor of technological solutions. And also on the policy attitudes, the private sector sees the role of CDR more necessary to achieve the EU climate targets, whereas the NGOs are more in favor to keep the targets separate for mitigation actions and for carbon dioxide removals. So finally, some quick conclusions. So as said, these methods have trade-offs, so we will need a portfolio of these technologies to reduce these risks. We cannot rely just on one way to remove carbon from atmosphere. And NEGEM will continue this work. And already at this point, we know that cooperation between EU member states is needed, considering the CO2 storage resources and the biomass resources. Constanze will show you more about this, but the global large-scale implementation of BECCS will require transformation of agricultural sector to free land for bioenergy crops. And in addition, as discussed this morning, new land management and cropping methods can provide solutions. And as said, BECCS from residues from biogenic point sources can also help here. We will have one presentation on the regulation as well. So it's important to understand the characteristics of these different CDR methods to create efficient regulation. So the nature-based and technical solutions have a little bit different key challenges, and the permanence of the storage is a key question here. And the nature-based solutions can provide several co-benefits. So we need an instrument that allows taking advantage of these opportunities without undermining the case for investment in more permanent carbon storage solutions, because we will need those as well. So that was my introduction to NEGEM and to this workshop, and I'm very much waiting for the following presentation. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Kati, for keeping the time and for the perfect introduction. Are there any questions already from the floor? Yes, one from Chris down there. Please, Chris, can you introduce yourself, state name, affiliation, and then.
Yes, so I am Chris Navens of Solution. I was just wondering, in one of the slides you showed some negative ecosystem impacts associated with biochar. So I was wondering, I don't know whether maybe we can come up again later.
On the LCA, the health. Yeah, I at least there are the particulate emissions that affect, I think, in this health category, and in ecosystems category. I must say, I don't remember.
There's some indirect, I mean, I can't describe it because I haven't wanted to do the work, so I'll start at hand. But what I would say is there are also indirect emissions from end-to-end emissions from that whole preparation of land and needing to provide, you know, the right level of inputs and fertilizer input to land. So this is the entire life cycle input-output balance being accounted for there. That has to factor those elements in as well. So I know that those components also play a role, although whether that's directly responsible for the pink, I'm not sure.
I now see that I have marked that it's also the water consumption of the system that they have analyzed to be negative for the ecosystem compared to the other.
I will have a presentation exactly on this. So I can say, I think it's because of the transport emissions of biomass residues and then biochar to the field is the main driver of this type of emissions. And so emissions are actually declining on the field.
Thank you.
Hi, just a quick question. You mentioned in the last slide that you also think that biomass residues would be a source. What do you guys feel about municipal solid waste as a source as well as a feedstock for carbon dioxide removal?
It's not part of of the feedstocks that has been studied in our project.
Okay, thank you.
But I guess it can have potential also for CCU purposes, maybe.
Okay. Okay, so many questions already. Let's go. I think we'll take this last one and then we move to the next presentation.
Hand over the microphone. Luís Tarelli from Aveiro University in Portugal. Tell me, how can your work and your project is based on getting, and the topic is negative emissions. How can you get negative emissions when you use thermochemical conversion processes as gasification or combustion? I don't understand. How can you get negative emissions?
So
CO2 emissions.
So you account for the CO2 that is sequestered by the growing biomass. And then at the end, you capture the emission from the combustion, and then you store that. So that's the...
You are talking about to do the capture of the CO2 and sequestration of CO2.
Yes.
Have you made an energy balance to the integrated process of combustion and carbon dioxide sequestration on a combustion facility?
Yes, they have in ICL, yes.
Yes?
Yes.
Responding to that, that part is very well characterized in the literature. So the question that you're alluding to is, are the indirect emissions from the plant, so actual energy required for combustion or the subsequent treating, etc., once you account for that, is it still negative? The answer to that is, if you made the right supply chain decisions and if you operate the plant in the right kind of way, you can achieve substantial negative emissions. There are also really bad ways to do it. And in those instances, you might come away with neutral. There are pilot scale assessments, but there haven't really been any large scale implementations of bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, but we are due to see some very, very soon. And I'm speaking from the UK context because that's where I'm based. So that's something that might be interesting to catch up on. Yeah,
thank you. Today we are focusing on, let's say, the most scientific part of the project. I would like to say we also have industrial partners in the project that are actually developing bio-CCS projects, not only bio-CCS, and they are implementing it at scale. The main issue with NEGEM is to quantify the responsible potential for deploying these solutions. And with this, I would like to introduce our next speaker, Constanze Werner from Potsdam Institute from Climate Research. Her presentation will be on the potential of biomass-based NETPS with planetary boundaries and opportunities for land-neutral negative emissions through biochar sequestration. Constanze, please, the floor is yours.
Perfect, thank you. And thanks for your kind introduction of the whole project. Also, Kati. I'm Constanze Werner, and I work together with my colleague Johanna Braun at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. And in the NEGEM project, we lead the working package on environmental impacts. And this is why I want to introduce you to some of our studies and findings on the potential of biomass-based nets within planetary boundaries. So when we talk about planetary boundaries, we are talking about a concept that goes beyond just climate stabilization. We are talking about the multifaceted impacts of nets on the Earth system resilience. And here we use the concept of Rockström et al. And the redefinitions of Steffen et al., where we see those 9 dimensions of the Earth system that all have a limit to the human interference with the Earth system, where we have in green a sort of safe operating space. But if we cross this threshold of a control variable of this human interference, we are entering a zone of uncertainty where destabilization is, or the risk is increasing for destabilization, and then even we might enter the red zone of high risk, meaning that there's a lot of scientific evidence that we might have, that we will have this destabilization of really critical Earth system functions. And this means leaving the Holocene state, leaving the state in which humanity could thrive the way we did. So this is essential. And often when we talk about CDR methods, about negative emission technologies, we talk about the planetary boundary of climate change, because just as Kati mentioned, we want to draw down the emissions, we want to go even negative if we can, and we want to use CDR for this, or we have to use CDR for this, according to the scenarios. But often we do not account for what it means for the other planetary boundaries. And what we wanted to apply here is a rationale of Earth system resilience that really puts the climate protection in the context of other planetary boundaries. And with our research, we assessed the impacts of land-based nets on 4 terrestrial planetary boundaries. So a selection of those where land-based nets have the highest impact and the largest effect. And this would be the nitrogen flows, freshwater use, land system change, and biosphere integrity. And we assess this by spatially explicit modeling of the impacts on planetary boundaries with our biosphere model, LPGML. And the studies that I want to introduce and the findings operate on 3 types of land cover and land use. First, on natural land, we want to see, okay, how much potential of biomass plantations for BECCS is there without further transgression of subglobal planetary boundaries? So regional contributions to transgressing those boundaries, let's say. And here it's important to note that it's not really possible within planetary boundaries because so many are already transgressed. If we now introduce another measure, it's quite, we would first need to draw down the pressure on all those boundaries and then think about new measures. So it's definitely a point where you have to think about co-benefits. So this first study was on not putting further pressure on it or not further transgression of those boundaries. Then we also assess the impacts of rededicating pasture areas to those biomass plantations or use it for reforestation. And the third analysis is operating on cropland, because here we wanted to assess the approach of land and calorie neutral PUCs, standing for biogenic carbon capture and storage, so basically biochar sequestration, without additional pressures on planetary boundaries. So addressing this topic here on cropland as well. Okay, so this is our cool model, or just really simple version of it. The LPGML is a biosphere model that is process-based and simulates the key ecosystem functions and direct coupling of carbon, water, and nitrogen, super complex and really a beast, but it can help us to simulate all those processes that are required to evaluate the planetary boundaries, the 4 that I've showed you. And these processes are simulated for natural functional types, but also for crop functional types, and very important here that we can also simulate those processes on plantations for lignocellulosic bioenergy crops. For the first study, for the potential on natural land, we found that there's basically no potential of BECCS, or let's say biomass plantations for BECCS outside agriculture areas without further transgressions of planetary boundaries and full forest protection. What does that mean? We started off with looking at the globe and exclude all agricultural land, assuming that we need this for food production, and we just leave it for that. Outside this, how much potential would there be if we convert this all to biomass plantations? Obviously a lot. So there's more than 30 gigatons of CO2 you could sequester each year. But we then introduced the different constraints of the planetary boundaries. So in the color scheme, you'll also see darker colors of blue are more irrigation, and darker colors of yellow-orange are more more fertilizer, so the colors will also change, not only the extent. So here we implemented the freshwater boundary, here the constraint to nitrogen flows, so colors change. And then the land system change planetary boundary, which is actually being assessed through limits to deforestation. And then also the biosphere integrity boundary, which is really harsh because it's about species abundance dependent on land use and land use intensity. And it really blocks a lot. So we have about 1 gigaton CO2 left per year with all those constraints. But then we saw it actually affects a lot of forests. And of course, just because the land system change boundary says, okay, there is still some room in the safe operating space, it doesn't mean we need to fully exploit this, but we might want to save the forest for the carbon storage it is, and also for other conservational reasons. So we actually excluded this too, and it's about 0 gigaton CO2. I think it's a very, very small number. It's not 0, but close to 0 gigaton CO2 if we implement all those constraints. So what this means for our research was basically we need to unlock some other land. And here we thought about the pasture areas because it's such a large fraction of the globe, right? And with the 3,000 mega hectares, it's twice as much as cropland. And here we have a lot of potential by shifting diets to less livestock products and then preserve the natural vegetation and rededicate pastures to, let's say, biomass plantations for BECCS or for reforestation. And here we considered the Eat Landsat Planetary Health diet because it was developed to contribute to both human and planetary health. So it was a nice guidance for us here. And we just wanted to see, okay, if we just follow this super healthy diet to 100%, it would mean that meat consumption would be needed to be reduced by 70%. And we translated this in a reduction in grazed biomass and then developed spatially explicit pasture rededication scenarios that are equivalent to this grazing reduction. So as you can imagine, if you reduce 70% of the meat consumption, you don't need so many cows anymore for this. And this was about like 800 mega hectares of pastures that could be rededicated. So it's a the 100% reaching this target is of course very ambitious. So we also tested for getting there halfway, for example. Okay, what we found is depending on what you do with this land, you have different CDR potentials, of course. So the reforestation part is always a bit lower. And then we have for BECCS 2 pathways that we assessed with really systematic approaches. So of course, there's also a range for those pathways, biomass to electricity and biomass to liquid. And we also, with this error bar, we tested for some management intensities on the plantations. So we see here, for example, this was a 30-year evaluation period for both nets, and then the yearly, and then divided by 30, so you get the yearly average. So it's a bit different than what the IPCC does, but we just wanted to compare this quickly so I can show you that this is, of course, when we look at the DC 100 numbers, this is very, very ambitious, and even more than the IPCC assumes in 2100, because we are having this really crazy rededication scenario and this really ambitious diet change. So we need to consider this as well. But as we are all about the impacts, I just want to show you what this would mean for the planetary boundaries on freshwater, nitrogen, and land system. So on the left side, we have the BECCS results. And as you could expect, if you manage the plantation, if you irrigate it, if you fertilize it, you have more pressure on those boundaries. And for the total achievement of the Eat Landsat Planetary Health diet and under moderate management, this would imply a 50% increase in areas with transgression of these environmental boundaries. So quite a massive expansion, assuming that this land use baseline is our total land use today. And if we add 50%, that's quite a magnitude. It doesn't have an effect on the land system change boundary if we rededicate pasture to biomass plantations, because it wasn't forest before, it is not forest now, so it doesn't really change the status. But of course, for reforestation, it would mean that we have a deforested area, or an area that might have been deforested before and now reforest it. And we can see the beneficial effect here. And for the African and American tropical forest, this could mean that we could even move them back into the safe operating space if we would achieve this total health diet, which I said is quite ambitious, but you can also see the other scenarios of getting the halfway or 25%. So what we learned from this is that any conversion of the natural land for CDR would further undermine the terrestrial planetary boundaries and other targets, and that the land availability for CDR depends on what we do with agriculture, and that we can do something with pasture areas and diet changes. Also, the biomass plantations, or the rededication of pastures to biomass plantation, showed that we have more CDR than reforestation, but it could come at the cost of drastic trade-offs with the terrestrial boundaries, at least if it's not sustainably managed, or if this sustainable management cannot be ensured globally, because at this conference, we will hear a lot of very, very cool sustainable management options. These were, of course, not included here, so these can give quite a different picture. But I really want to show you this, because a lot of EAMs and IPCC scenarios assume a really huge areas of monocultures, and we really need to be sure that we assess what happens with the Earth system if we apply these. And for reforestation, we say that it's maybe less efficient per area, but that we can achieve multiple sustainability targets by stabilizing both the climate and also forest systems. Do I have still time to get to the?
Yes.
Super. Just quickly to the cropland part. This approach that we assessed here, we call the land and calorie neutral PICS approach, that has no additional pressures on planetary boundaries. And what is the idea behind this? We take the biomass, pyrolysis it, and get those 3 pyrolysis products. And the one that we focus on here for the sequestration is the biochar, and assume to apply it on cropland because it has a lot of, or has been shown that it has a lot of beneficial effects here for the soil, resulting in quite significant crop yield increases. And this would mean that we could produce the same amount of calories on less land, and thus release some of the field, for example, a stripe or a fraction, to biomass production. And this would mean we could close the cycle again. We have the same amount of calories, we have more resilient soils, and we have CDR. So this is the concept that we wanted to test here, because we can still operate within the bounds of current cropland. When we calculated this for NEGEM, we found that the approach is a bit sensitive to a few factors, mainly how the biomass that you plant there is managed. Do you assume the same level of management as for the other cropland, or just leave it and have marginal management? Then the pyrolysis parameters, there are quite conservative numbers around, but also you can optimize the process quite strongly. And of course, the yield increase that you can achieve on this land really makes a difference, because the larger the yield increase, the larger the land you can use. And just a rough bar plot here, how this would look like. We could have a range from 0 to 2.5 gigatons of CO2 sequestered per year with this approach. And this is mainly depending on First, the yield increases that can be achieved, here tested for 5 to 20%. Then the next most important factor is the management in purple and in blue. And then you see also the last factor, which are the pyrolysis parameters. So what we conclude from this study is that this approach may contribute to climate stabilization without further pressures on land, resources, and food security. So this is already good. And then we really learned that accounting for those co-benefits is really worth for all those scenarios and assessments. And this is not often done, especially not for those global simulations and models. We also concluded that the research and practice should always aim for developing the best biochar application that is achievable under the field-specific conditions to maximize the potential. This seems really obvious, but there's quite a lot of averages around when you talk about biochar, but we would always want to go for the maximum. So we should really debate this. And then the assessment of biomass-based nets requires also elaborate models and databases on residue and waste use. As we said, we haven't assessed those here, but we really acknowledge this because large-scale deployment of PICs or any biomass-based net should not rely solely on purpose-grown biomass, and especially not biochar sequestration, because it's actually an advantage that it can be adapted to a diverse system and use residues and waste and so on. So with this, I want to thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Constanze. Good. So you had an overview of one of the supply-driven approaches that are used in NEGEM. I think we have time for questions if there are any. Andre?
Okay, thank you very much. And I think it's really great that you're able to show how an integrated assessment model like framework is, and the outcomes of it are influenced by the improvement options and management options that you put into it. So the biochar is a very nice one. And you made an important remark in your presentation that you said, okay, there's a lot of options we did not include yet. I think that's important indeed, because like nitrogen is a key one. And I would assume that many of the agricultural production options rely on artificial fertilizers in the model. But there is also many options to fix nitrogen by natural waste. So that's a possibility. You can close the cycle, especially depending on your biomass conversion, you can get the nitrogen back if you want to. So that's one. Go from monocultures to agroforestry is one, intercropping is one. So what I think would be very nice is to have a whole list of these improvement options that you partly included and not included, and then have a huge agenda for future work, because I would love to see LPG run when more and more improvement options that we have at our disposal are introduced. And I think then we're doing a very good thing, because we can say, okay, in areas where there's more drought or regular rainfall patterns, we can do things with water retention, which is important, like we know here, right? Just last week,
absolutely.
Things were flooded. So more vegetation is a good thing. And so I think you have a mighty tool that's still, I would estimate, for 70% empty.
Yeah.
And so I see a NEGEM 2 coming up.
It is already really huge and needs a lot of things. We tried for 10 years to get the proposals through that had agroforestry in, and it was denied every time. But now something is starting. So let's see about that. But we tried for a long time and nobody wanted to fund it. But now it's starting. So this is recorded, but I can tell you later. Because I might apply again sometime. Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Andre. Any other questions? No, for the moment, no. So for the record, there is one project, very interesting project. It's called MIDAS. You can find information down there. And it's about exactly growing industrial crops on marginal land, including agroforestry systems. And they have experimental trials here close by on the hills. And with industrial crops, the slopy areas where they put the test fields, they were already covered with the crops, and they were preserved by the floods that arrived here 3 weeks ago. Okay, you can find more information down in the exhibition area. Now, our third presenter from NEGEM Partners, is Nixon from the Imperial College of London. His presentation will be about developing a portfolio of negative emission technologies for EU member states in line with the Paris Agreement. Thank you, Nixon, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Mauricio, and thanks to the presenters that went before me for setting the context in place and setting the stage quite nicely for me to rush through the slides. So I have a challenge ahead of me. I have far too many slides and far too little content to offer, but I'm hoping to give you the core messages in a quick minute, and then hopefully you take that away if you take nothing else from the presentation. So the first point that I want to say is that if we are trying to do carbon removals at scale in Europe, European member states will have to work very closely together and also work with regions outside of Europe, because without it, there's not going to be a significant amount of CO2 removal at scale. The second point that I'll say is that in that vision, European member states will have to be very granular in setting forward standards and targets within a realistic time frame, because that is a big area of uncertainty, and you'll see that throughout the presentation. And the third component that I'll say is that biomass, what most of us are here at this conference to talk about, will play a very significant role in realizing the ambitions on CO2 removal. So with that, I'll start off with some of the work that we're doing in Work Package 4 in the NEGEM project. But I won't say all of what's on the slide, but what I'll say is that our core objective within this work package is to try to take all of the data that we found in literature on the need for negative emissions and all of the good work that's happening right now on the supply side potential for negative emissions, not only thinking biomass, but also thinking various other negative emissions technologies such as direct air capture, enhanced weathering, soil carbon sequestration, and so on, to come away with a realistic mix on a portfolio of CO2 removal technologies that we can deploy across each member state. That's the core objective of our work package. And in our work package, we primarily look at it through an economics lens. So we will generally be doing a lot of costing. But quite a lot of the analysis that you'll see here today will mostly be driven by our assessments of technical potential and portfolio assessment. So the first point, as I mentioned, the demand for CDR is unknown. Where you end up on that, let's bring up a laser pointer. So where you end up on the need for CO2 removal, it could be zero, it could be well above 1,000 gigatons worth of cumulative removal by 2100, is anybody's guess. You could end up somewhere in between. Given what we know about how we've done things in the past, we're more likely to end up something closely resembling a P3 scenario, but that's not actually great news in the context of carbon removal. So, starting with the picture that we don't know what we're in for, how do we figure out what each member state should do in Europe? This obviously is a very deeply political process. We generally have in the past with other elements of sustainability debated amongst the member states, particularly with targets for renewable deployment. And we are likely to see a similar process emerge in the context of carbon removal. But also in that paradigm, we can use a handful of burden sharing principles to help us think about what might constitute a realistic amount of CO2 removal for each member state. So, what might Germany do in contrast to a country such as Portugal? So if you look at the literature, you find that a lot of studies have actually looked at this particular picture, and they've looked at what should each member state do and what should Europe do around the, in comparison to other regions around the globe. And really, the answer depends quite significantly on your starting assumption around how you allocate responsibility to the region. Here, we have a piece of work that was published in 2020 with some of my colleagues, but also with the leading author, Carlos. They looked at a portion in the global cumulative removal of CO2
based on an IPCC P3 scenario. And they made the assumption that given Europe's contribution to greenhouse gas emissions in the past, it will do approximately equivalent amount of effort in removing CO2 emissions in the future. So if you were to do that, Europe would have to fundamentally, take responsibility for over 20% of the effort. And there, in that particular scenario, we're looking at a cumulative removal of around 270 gigatons worth of CO2. Now, we'll keep that number in mind. If you look at another principle, so this is the capacity principle, it's a measure of how you might be able to do more without sacrificing living standards. So in that context, Europe being a wealthy continent can afford to do more than other nations around the world. So if you were to apportion responsibility on that basis, you'd be intending to do a lot more CO2 removal. Yes.
So I was just wondering, what are the sort of factor 30-ish above America?
Great question. So this is on this particular basis, we're looking at they are looking at the emissions removal on a per capita basis. But we'll go on to what it means in aggregate later in the presentation as well. Great question though. And then if you apportion it purely based on population weighting, you come away with a completely different figure. So we saw 300 gigatons, we saw 200 gigatons, and now you see 30 gigatons. And what this is trying to say is that getting to a granular description of how much CO2 is needed and can be delivered in a given region is a very complicated question. And it will be something that we need to work through in the next 5-10 years' time, especially when we're trying to develop targets for how much a nation should do. But putting the demand picture aside, what about the supply of negative emissions? How much do we know about what we can do there? And there's a whole raft of work that's happening right now, but in general, the regional availability of resources dictate the technical potential to do CDR. So that's quite well known. And the second element that's critical there is that we need to actually have a good handle on that. We need to understand it to inform policymaking, and we need to also make sure that when we realize the technical potential, we also make the right supply chain decisions. We make intelligent decisions on how to design a plan, how to put supply chains in place to actually make use of that potential. So, alluding to that previous study again, we've seen that they looked at the domestic potential to do CDR alongside with that assessment of targets. And their assessment highlighted that a greater share of biomass availability can be achieved through agricultural and forestry residues, primarily in Europe. So you're looking at, some of the Nordic states with quite a lot of residue availability. But if you were to do a supply sink match with, how much you would have to do in European member states versus how much they have at hand in terms of biomass availability, only 3 to 6 member states can actually meet their own targets. And, bear in mind, when I say a target, we're talking provisional things here because nobody's set this out in stone yet. Now, this is the picture. It's quite a complicated picture, but let me try and break this down for you. On top, we have these various different icons that show how much CDR, how much CDR is going to be allocated on the basis of different burden sharing principles, as I alluded to, on a member state basis. So the circle represents how much a member state would do on the basis of the responsibility burden sharing principle. The square represents what a nation would do on a capacity principle, and then the triangle is based on the last principle that I shared earlier. And what I'm getting at is that whole region that we see on the left-hand side, that sees a significant mismatch between the supply, that is the bottom bar charts that you see there, versus the demand, that is those markers that you see up top. And that is a problem because if you are to develop a regional plan and you want to be insulated from the dynamics outside of the EU, then you have a picture where supply doesn't match demand, and that's not going to lead to a system that's going to be resilient in the long run. So that's not the only study that's looked at this. We can see that various others have also addressed this. Pete Smith has done quite a lot of good work on this in understanding what different CO2 removal technologies can do here. There's a list of technologies such as BECCS, direct air capture, enhanced weathering, afforestation, and so on. And here you have a measure of the uncertainty. So the cloud of points really represent the uncertainty. And here, you have whether it's net positive in energy or net negative, depending on the type of technology. But what we're really highlighting here is that there are some technologies that adopt to have very high deployment potential, such as BECCS and direct air capture. And there are some technologies that adopt to have a lower potential, such as biochar, soil carbon sequestration, and enhanced weathering, and so on. Some more assessment there. I won't go into too much detail here. So what are we doing here, and how are we doing it? So the first question, we are firstly trying to estimate the technical potential to deliver CDR using all the different types of technologies that I alluded to earlier. And secondly, how we're doing it is by using a tool that was developed at Imperial College through a series of PhDs. It's called the Monet framework. It is a model that's comprised of two stages. One is a supply chain modeling framework that looks at the emissions that occur along each step of the supply chain for different negative emissions technologies. And then the second component is an optimization component that determines how to design a portfolio of negative emissions technologies to minimize cost in this particular instance. For all the technologies that I mentioned here, there are natural limits on the level of deployment. So for bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, it may be limited by the availability of biomass, the need for the fuel or energy vector or whatever you want to have from the BECCS plant, or carbon storage, for example, similar sort of context in the case of biochar and various others. If you don't have land to spread it on, then you're not going to produce a lot of biochar. Availability is going to be a limiting factor. Availability of basic, or highly alkaline rocks is going to be a critical factor in the context of enhanced weathering. So all of these are constraints that would go on to define your technical potential. I think I've said most of this, but what I'll highlight is that in addition to the constraints, the technical potential will also be a function of the system that you start with. So the energy that you use to grind and crush a rock, or the energy that you need in order to be able to move biomass over a given distance, that's contingent on what we use as best case technology today. And it might be a diesel truck, or it might be an electric powered grinding system that's based on grid electricity that's carbon intensive. So those will all reduce your technical potential because they're not all net zero carbon right now. But they have the potential to get to net zero carbon in the future. And that's something to bear in mind as well. So we published this piece of work just last year. And it's not by no means a conclusive overview of the performance of different technologies. This is still one particular deterministic case. But what we are looking at is if you account for all the indirect emissions that happen along the supply chain, if you account for biogenic carbon losses along the chain, how much of the original carbon gets locked into a state that can be permanent over a long enough period of time. So that was the core aim of this particular piece of work. And we saw with BECCS, we've seen a CDR efficiency close to 70%, whereas with some other technologies like biochar, we're seeing a lower efficiency. But that's not to say that there's no other use for biochar, because obviously all the other elements such as biogases and oils have purpose and function. So this is by no means a conclusive assessment on how useful something is. I'm going to jump in through this, and I'm going to quickly rush through this because I'm seeing concerned faces over on the other side of the table.
30 minutes.
Excellent.
30 minutes. You should go.
So I'm going to offer some intuitions based on our preliminary results that look at the technical potential for different technologies. So we started with marginal land as our primary basis. That's our land type. And we're looking in the context of afforestation. We're looking at areas in Europe that have previously held forests. So we look primarily at lands with reforestation potential. And we asked the question, if we did everything right, and if we were able to establish those forests, what can we realistically do as cumulative carbon removal by 2100? And that's the figure we got. We got 30 gigatons CO2 removal by 2100 coming out of afforestation. And what goes into that? All of the supply chain emissions that I mentioned to you just now. But in addition to that, we developed a framework to look at the risk of wildfires, depending on frequencies of if those events happening in the past and so on. Now, bearing in mind, that's all caveated because the risk of those events changing in the future is something that we don't have a good handle on. Similarly, if you look at biochar, if you start with the assumption that we're going to use marginal land and we're going to use dedicated energy crops such as miscampers, and we're going to take use of all of the land that's available to us across all the different member states in Europe, we find that we can cumulatively deploy around 5 gigatons worth of biochar. Again, same point as before. This is all on the basis of that one particular technology archetype. But what's critical here is the difference in scale. With afforestation, we could do 30 gigatons. With biochar, we could only do 5. And why is that? We're seeing a lot of carbon losses in bio-oils and biogases. Now, if we use that bio-oils and biogases, and if we were to, meet the demands of various energy-intensive applications, and if we did carbon capture, for example, that CO2 removal would be very real, and it would supplement the figure that you see here. If we were to do BECCS, in this instance, this is just combustion power generation. When we didn't look very much at other archetypes, but if we were to look at BECCS, and if we assumed, again, committing one of the cardinal sins that Constanze warned us about, if we assume monoculture BECCS, miscampers on marginal agricultural land, we'll get about 50 gigatons worth of cumulative removal by 2100. And what's critical and what's worth pausing for a moment on is the sheer availability offered by states such as Spain. Because of the large amount of marginal agricultural land, the favorable conditions that you have in terms of yield, you can achieve a significant amount of CO2 removal, and that's going to play a meaningful role in achieving very high removal targets. But you don't really have to do miscampers. Why not look at willow? It's another dedicated energy crop, and various other biomass sources as well. So here, what we're really trying to showcase is that member states aren't all uniform in their ability to do things, and that's going to have a very tangible impact on how much can be done. Now, this is the very speculative plot, and I call it the very speculative plot because each one of the bars correspond to the availability of basalt in Europe. And this is on the basis of weathering rate of around 5%, which is if you were to get all of the potential, and if you were to crush and grind it and spread it, and in best case circumstance, you would achieve a weathering rate and a cumulative removal of around 80 gigatons. I'm going to quickly move over to the last two results because I've gotten the trigger from Maurizio.
Don't worry. Yeah, time to go to conclusion then.
Indeed. So just on the last couple of pieces. So moving from technical potential to cost-effective implementation, if we were to just use one burden sharing principle to define what the target is for CO2 removal in Europe, we would allocate based on a historical responsibility, and that would result in something which looks like this. And this is based on a P3 scenario. It results in a cumulative removal figure on an aggregate basis, and it comes to around 80 gigatons worth of CO2 removal being done in Europe, but with the largest owners on states such as Germany, and also a region outside of Europe, European Union, UK, as you know. If we look at what a cost optimal portfolio of negative emissions look like in order to meet that target, we find that quite a lot of it's BECCS. So the orange region that you see is mostly BECCS. Also a very significant amount of afforestation in that system. Limited amount of biochar and enhanced weathering, especially in cases where CO2 storage is not readily available or not readily within reach, or if the supply chain are quite difficult to establish. And what I want to highlight is that if we flip back again over to this slide, the target for CO2 removal in some of these states, especially in the context of Spain and so on, are relatively low. But if you look at the supply of negative emissions, we find that there's a significant share of the EU supply being offered by states with those potential. And this shouldn't be a surprise in the sense that it's going to be a cost-effective scenario for those states to collaborate and offer those services. But what it does also mean is that the regulation and the standards and the economic policy have to be aligned so that the accounting frameworks can utilize that to a great degree. I won't talk about this, but I can share the slides so that we can have the discussion. But the key takeaway here is that each one of these technologies, when you implement it, they don't just have the CO2 removal effects. They also generate other effects such as employment effects and also macroeconomic impacts. Some of the constraints that I wanted to just flag is that I just presented a deterministic set of results, and that was just one set of results. And that's already told us a lot about the role of biomass and the state of CO2 storage as well. Because even getting to 100 gigatons and pushing beyond 100 gigatons is going to be very challenging in cumulative removal just by looking at the EU alone. So the EU will need to bring in other actors with storage capabilities outside of the region to even go beyond. And if we're looking at P1, P2 scenarios, that may be feasible with an EU-centric view, but the states will still need to collaborate. If we end up in a world where we look at an IPCC P3 or P4 scenario, the EU will need extensive collaboration with regions outside with significant amount of financial implications for that as well. And the last bit that I wanted to highlight was that uncertainty analysis is what we're spending the vast majority of our time doing now in the latter phase of the project to just provide a richer description of what I just discussed. Happy to take any questions if we have any time, but I'll be around and I'll happily field questions after the session as well.
Thank you, Nixon. Thank you. Any questions? Yes, the lady.
Rania Wolnik from German Biomass Research Center. I have a question on the cumulative CO2 removal potential, the couple of charts that you showed. So you always use the total marginal land available and then used it 100% for this one measure, right? Would there be the potential of synergies that could evolve if you apply several? Are you planning to analyze that?
That's right, yes. Okay. So the question is, would it be better to consider multiple feedstocks and account for the synergies offered by multiple feedstocks? And the answer is absolutely yes, both from an economic picture, but also in boosting the uptake and the availability of biomass as well. So just by having certain crops that offer higher CO2 removal by boosting soil uptake of carbon is also another element that we want to capture in a bit more detail. So that's absolutely.
I think there was another question, the gentleman.
Hi, Ken Jung-woo from National Zhongxin University, Taiwan. I have two questions. The first one is about your study. We always say that the BECCS is very nice picture for that, but the CCS, including the CCU or not, or only the storage. The second is compared to the coal-fired power plant. CCS probably is okay because the scale is very large one. But for the BECCS, CCS inside the BE is very, very small scale. So BE is okay, CC is okay, but storage probably is the problem. It's not every country like the UK, they have a large biomass power plant like drugs. Have a larger the BECCS, but it still have a problem. Is where is the storage area? We can't collect BECCS, the carbon dioxide, and then move to the big size. So what is the situation where you need to sort out that? So that's my two questions. Thank you.
Thank you. So let me address them one by one. So for the first question, the question was whether we look at CCU alongside CO2 storage, and the quick answer is no. We look primarily at CO2 storage, and that's based on the framing. We're looking at permanent geological storage because we're looking at trying to take CO2 removal, trying to take CO2 and store it away for a long period of time. And then the second question around, is it really feasible to consider BECCS in the way that we've done here for all the other regions? This is where it gets a little bit nuanced because, while I appreciate that not every plant is like Drax in the UK, where we have significant scales and, you can just turn over a coal-fired power station into the bioenergy component. The risk in the initial case is that you don't have sufficient amount of transport and storage infrastructure in place to be able to take the CO2 to wherever you want to store it. But we are seeing that risk being mitigated through projects that are being developed, say, for example, in Germany, through, in Norway and so on, with various different transportation means. There are clusters of projects in Antwerp, for example, that are looking at industrial CCS, primarily with this lens of pooling together CO2 from multiple sources, many small sources, much smaller than the bioenergy component that you were alluding to there, to provide sufficient economies of scale so that they can store it elsewhere. And then the other component is that while we might not see bioenergy plant implementations of, a BECCS plant of 5 megawatts or 10 megawatts, we don't necessarily need to do everything via BECCS either. It holds a very significant potential, but also at small scales, there are also a range of other technologies such as biochar that offer that value. So, the other element is that you can use biochar in cases where it adds value in your particular circumstance. And in large scale implementations where you have a lot of low cost feedstock available, then, technologies such as BECCS are a no-brainer. Does that answer your question, by the way? Okay.
I'd like to invite the next speaker, Andre Fay, Director of Science at TNO, driving below zero GHG emissions, how the energy transition and industrial transformation can deliver on climate targets, circularity, and sound economics.
Fine.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And
It's always disturbing when people are leaving.
no,
But maybe first a little bit.
No,
of
no. Okay.
I don't like this.
Informally, we should close by 6:20, but we can still keep some time. But
No,
let's go.
yeah. No. Let's
Sorry.
keep it short.
It's
Actually,
always difficult when you see questions and interaction. Okay, thank you.
Actually, I'm a little bit uncomfortable with what I brought because the focus is so much on the negative emissions, while my story is more general. How
I'm sure you have.
do these negative emissions fit in the larger transition? But I will kind of browse through like a little video, and maybe refer to some work that may be interesting to look at in this context. Actually, I have more material for the Netherlands and a little bit of Europe, while dedicated work we did on negative emissions, especially BECCS, and spatially explicit. That also includes all the logistics, and so where's the biomass available, where can you store the CO2, the pipelines, and all that was done recently for China, for Brazil, and Colombia, and really with high level of detail. And that also shows, okay, where these economic sweet spots are. I mean, let that be my key point. So not so much about the carbon balances and the precise hectare, but more the economics. So let's see if that contributes. Now I should, that's weird. Yeah, that's weird. So we know this. We have to go down. We have to go down fast. We're on the right-hand side. We have an overshoot. And we're talking about 100, 200, maybe 300 gigaton of CO2 that we need to remove from the atmosphere this century, depending on how we do also on short term with how fast we bring down emissions. So there's a fantastic report from the UK, the Mind the Gap report. They did a very good job in mapping all the options that NEGEM went into in detail. The graphic on the right top is for the Netherlands with a dent in the first linear emission reduction, and then with the corrected data when those targets were sharpened. So it's just very, very fast, and a lot after that. Scenarios for the Netherlands, classic, very classic analysis with optimization modeling, bottom up, a lot of technical detail. I mean, the technical detail of the current models with temporal resolution, even spatial resolution, more and more technologies, and that's important for this talk on industry and how can industry decarbonize, including circularity options next to the classic mitigation, improving existing processes, introducing new processes that are not commercial yet. That is now part of the modeling. And this is very classic in the sense that can we do the targets 2050? Yes, you can do it in different ways, and adapt is more an approach where we lose a lot of the existing stuff. So also existing industries like the big petrochemical complexes that are there in Rotterdam Harbor, but also beyond Antwerp and the Ruhr. So it's there for the whole other cluster. It's a big beast that could be modified. And biomass plugins are an example of that. And definitely also BECCS options are part of that. And maybe also for 2050, CCS with fossil fuels is part of it. And you see that in ADAPT, there is still a share from 25%, far less than today, of fossil fuels compensated by classic CCS. And on top of that, you see the green part in that scenario, that's biomass. That's a lot of biomass for the Netherlands, maybe 300 exajoules or so, may come from national sources. The rest needs to be imported one way or the other. So here's the story, okay, better land use in Europe, maybe even beyond that could do a lot of wind, a lot of solar. And transform is more drastic in the sense that also principal choices, fossil fuels needs to be out. There's more emphasis on consumption changes and circularity, so pushing that more. And that reduces the final energy demand more strongly. There is, because fossil fuels are really squeezed out, there is a bigger role for wind and solar. So you see more electrification and also more power to X in that sense. Biomass is sizable, but smaller in that scenario. And it could also deliver negative emissions. So this is kind of a bandwidth, and it's important that we still have that bandwidth there, depending on the strategies that are chosen, also depending how the development is on these different options. The biomass is one of the biggest uncertainties. Will we get the sustainable resources or not? Talked about this morning. It is depending on very different policy arenas than just climate change, as we know. So I should push the right button. Now this looks like a very boring graphic, but it is actually a very important outcome because it puts the emphasis on what does it cost. And that is at the end of the day. Still, if you look at what does make stakeholders move, whether households, whether they're industries, etc. This is what it is about. And important, referring again to the high granularity of these models, also with the learning curves and all this stuff in there, is that at the moment we would do a run without a target and say, okay, we're just slow in pushing that. So these 2050 scenarios, of course, are aggressive. You really need to change things with the infrastructure, with the investment a lot. And we're still today on a pathway that we're not going to make it. So suppose that happens and a remaining share, there is a lot of autonomous improvement, remaining share is still going to be used by fossil. This is about half. And we have fossil energy prices as projected a few years ago, before the war in Ukraine, by the International Energy Agency. Actually, the cost of the energy system goes up. So fossil fuels do not get cheaper. We see that today. And this is not the price levels that we have today, right? Current natural gas prices, LNG based in Europe, are 2 times higher than what's assumed here. So this would be like 150, 160% compared to the reference level chosen here. That's interesting. ADEPT, and then 2030, ADEPT was chosen as the 100% level. So it is a relative measure. And is lower than the one with no target. It gradually goes up, and that is because there is partly still share of fossil fuels, and also there's more conventional technologies used that have less learning potential. So there is a reduction in cost, but it is not as drastic, and it gets depleted. While in transform, at first instance, upfront costs are higher. So we look at less mature technologies, but then these learning curves kick in. And then the cost reductions over time get stronger. And that's consistent with various other scenarios that zoomed into it. Overall message, meeting the targets, even whether you do it in a more conventional way or a more aggressive way, is cheaper than being lazy. That's really interesting. And especially for Europe now, with the current situation that we have fossil fuel energy imports, that's not these figures. Those figures are more terrible today. It is macroeconomically really stupid not to do that energy transition. So that is overall important, because in that is, of course, a huge system change, a lot of options merging together, and especially heavy industry, which is about half the total greenhouse gas emissions of a country like the Netherlands. And it also would apply to a large part of Germany and Belgium with that huge industrial base. That is where a big part of the puzzle is, and also a big part of the solution. But there's 3 bullets there that really have to remind you that this is a perfect picture. It's optimization, right? So cost minimization. So it's all options need to contribute. If you cut out options like the biomass ones, the costs go up. So because you need more from the remaining ones, you push the potentials and you get higher up in the supply curves. All these options are supply curves. The more you want from it, the more expensive it gets. So the more options you have, the more you can stay in the lower part of the supply curve. That's one explanation. Second is continuous efforts on innovation. So these learning curves I mentioned a few times are crucial. If we're bad at it, and the biomass field is a key example where we have been bad in pushing learning curves because of unstable policy climates, the learning curves are slow. We have seen fast ones like wind offshore. It's a cool one and it could continue for floating wind and all that. But we need that across the board because all options need to contribute. And then the last one, optimal planning. And that is about balancing all these options. Like we have now wind offshore, it's doing a great job, but wind prices decline in the moments there is a big surplus. So where's the demand? So at the moment, not having enough demand for electricity is a problem and can slow down developments. And there are many, many more of those situations on the horizon that if we do not avoid them, things will slow down. So it is really a perfect picture, but it can be done. And I think that's important context for zooming in on industry, where we don't only have a mitigation challenge, but we also have a circularity challenge. And that's, of course, where biomass is important with a circular carbon, if you do that right, and also in a sustainable way, but also where a lot of the materials, including carbon from plastics and all that, need to come back as much as possible. So this overlapping area is still poorly considered. It's poorly considered even in modeling today, and it is also poorly considered in policies, but it's also where a lot of synergy can be achieved. So, and then it's about bottom-up understanding. What do we have at our disposal? When can we deploy it? What is a good mix? So it is, of course, efficiency improvement. It is new processes. That's a difficult one. So for many of these heavy industries, there are much better processes on the horizon, but not commercial yet. So when is the moment that we consider them commercial? And how does it coincide with your capital stock today? And what is a good moment to do that? So this is already very difficult in terms of planning. Renewable feedstock, okay, we have said a lot about that. When had the renewable energy carriers, of course. So electrification is a key option, but we need enough of that and in the right patterns, and green hydrogen on top of that. But how expensive will it be? CCS, infrastructure, the negative emissions options, and what's the share of circularity? On top of that, we have the question on shifts in markets and products. So we hope, of course, that lifestyle changes and consumer preference will also help to push down those emissions, but we're not sure. And we may see some industries decline and others grow because of those consumer preferences. So altogether, adding it up in the database, and all, there's enough potential. So that's also confirmed by the scenario. So we don't have a problem in that, but we have a problem in the coordination of that and in the time. 3 decades to do the job, while we're looking at investment cycles in these heavy industries, but also in infrastructure easily of 20 or more years. So there is basically one moment in time, if you want a real overhaul or choose for a new factory, that is a different process in the time frame coming to decide that. And that requires a really good radar on, okay, where are these sweet spots in investments? What are the preconditions? What are the risks of that? So any factory and company would look at the investor risk. And that radar is still poor. And that is kind of a bit of a deadlock in making decisions, because most companies would say, I wait. You know, that's real option theory. You just wait. And that slows things down. So we don't want that. So that's why these type of analysis are really important. So circularity here can be fast. So this is a great area. It can contribute hugely. So this is European figures for plastics. So we see today, okay, there is the classic mechanical recycling that contributes with, I think, some 30% even, if you add everything up. So a lot of it is upfront in the chain and not so much post-consumer. But we expect a lot, for example, from chemical recycling technologies, which can be really nice ones in terms of back to monomer. So PET, PEF, that could be bio-based, could do a fantastic job in overall chain performance. It could also be when you have really miserable material, and a lot of the waste that we get is miserable. You may go to plasma upgrading, bigger losses, but it could still bring the carbon back into production. Of course, it means that the entire infrastructure and the production chain changes. So you do things in a different place. The core process at the start looks different. It gets different feedstocks. And of course, this will not be 100%. So you also need a renewable biogenic contribution to that as well. Electrification, that is a really interesting field. It is from the very, very simple power to heat options. So the electric boilers that can ensure an electricity demand already on short term and replace natural gas. So it's cheap, it's flexible, that's great. Up to the direct electrification for CO2 chemistry. Ammonia, for example, solid state catalysis is an interesting process that's lower TRL, but that could convert basically air, water, electricity with the right catalyst directly to ammonia. So that is the type of processes that are game changers, potentially, when we get them on the market on time, and do not require any intermediate hydrogen production. There's many more that could also lead to different platform chemicals, etc. So it's a very exciting area, but the question is a bit, will it deliver on time? And then what is really key, and also for BECCS, is that it is not about individual routes, say only on hydrogen or only on biomass or only on electricity. And that is depicted by these graphics that was already addressed in a European advisory report several years ago. Look at these combinations. So at the moment, you're thinking about petrochemical industry, which is huge, but also the refineries that deliver fuel and the crackers and all that around it. It is a bit about thinking those could be platforms, so maybe not just one fact, but platforms where green hydrogen, green electricity, recycled carbon, biogenic carbon, etc., all come together in variable quantities and prices. And at the moment, these platforms are able to deal with variable shares, maybe not from 0 to 100, but at least a certain flexibility. You have a very powerful tool to respond to the uncertainties that are there, because we cannot predict the future in terms of the future energy system. Respond to prices, so you can optimize. Industries love that. And also you become a stabilizing factor in that integrated future energy system, where fluctuating supply and demand of power, hydrogen, and also biomass for sure over time will occur. So thinking about processes that have that inherent flexibility, and that is design of industrial clusters, but also of the technologies, is one of the key tools. In that, for sure, is BECCS. So think about basic reactions for digestion. Pure CO2 is delivered. Fermentation, pure CO2 is delivered. Gasification, concentrated CO2 is usually produced because of higher efficiency in those processes. Those three core basic reactions that we often see in biomass conversion allow for very cheap, up to almost free CO2 removal. And when it's biogenic, it's pure. So that's fantastic. Brazil, with its sugar ethanol complex, already has pure CO2 available in industrial quantities. So BECCS there, which we analyzed, can be done with a few dozen dollars per ton of CO2 sequestered just below the sugar factories. And those opportunities really become stronger at the moment you look at these new processes of these new factories over time. So we're looking at BECCS that could deliver well below $50 per ton, looking at the right technical possibilities. Now that is a real business case, looking at, for example, ETS prices of about 100 euros per ton, right? Then you can really sell as a company. So that's a key thing. Here I can be fast. The uncertainties are about how does the energy system develop. For our region, so our region in Northwestern Europe, the North Sea is key. So the current talking is about 400-500 gigawatts of wind power, right? And this is increasing almost by the year. Every new agreement around the North Sea, kind of people start to realize, we need more than we thought. So this is a stylized graphic that is also interlinked with GIS analysis. So where can those big wind parks be positioned over time, also floating? What is a good layout of the infrastructure? Will it be power, hydrogen, and when what ratio? But the point is that on the shore, it will be also uncertain within bandwidth. So that's why that flexibility is important. What is, by the way, a wild card here is how much hydrogen will come from outside Europe, which is also interesting. Biomass, that's the point I made this morning. This graphic is in that energies paper, so some blatant self-promotion, but then I don't have to explain it here. Europe could get stuck with its biomass, about 7 exajoules today. It could quadruple if we set our mind to it with better farming, the marginal degraded lands, better forest management, etc. And that is underpinned by so many studies that also look at these improvement options we've been talking about. Looking at the modeling, I will be very fast on that after this. We may not even need that techno-economic and sustainable potential. About tripling of that biomass for 7 to 21, 25 exajoules would probably be optimal for Europe. So we don't even need more because also solar, wind, etc. efficiency will deliver, and also circularity options. But those type of volumes, so we go to about, let's say, 21 to 25 exajoules, is a quarter and pointing to about 1/3 of Europe's future energy demand. And that could deliver half to about 0.7 gigaton of CO2 captured in BECCS installations, acknowledging that part of the carbon is in the product. So that's a big contribution and a structural contribution, because the industrial infrastructure we're then talking about, the pipelines, is something that we would probably then have the rest of the century. And that would be a structural contribution of about 0.5 gigaton per year at those low costs. So that's interesting. Well, okay, the global situation, I talked about it. We don't know. It could be disappointing. It could be spectacular. And then we have to kind of find the right balance. It would be a good thing, by the way, if that develops fast. And this is work, I mean, it's a reference from 2018, so a little bit late, a little bit older, but it looks at the European energy system. So this is total EU for 2050, meeting the targets with very different energy systems. So taking those uncertainties I briefly talked about to the extreme. On the right-hand side, disappointing biomass. So the 7 exajoules are there, but they will move from a large share of power and heat, which is today, largely to fuels and feedstock. So that's then optimal. You see that in all analysis that are integrated around biomass, and that's where your CCS options then, BECCS options then occur. But this is largely electrification. So huge amount of power to X, partly also CO2 chemistry, and that goes then onwards to the fuels, the feedstocks, and a lot of electrification at the end. That will work. You know, it is that solves the problem, but it also means the spaghetti in between is a completely different system than we have today, and we have less than 3 decades left. So that's a big question. On the right-hand side, maximum biomass, couldn't say, but it is 21 exajoules, so 3-fold to today, and that would allow for a lot of BECCS. So that's the figures I mentioned, and it would even on the short term, although we may not want to do that, allows for an amount of emission space, even in the current scenarios, for some natural gas compensation. Now, after the war in the Ukraine, clearly this was 2018, so then we were looking at low gas prices. We may not even want that, but we could be quicker on the negative emission capacity that we want operational till the year 2100, as NEGEM has done. More analysis, I will go to one picture where this integrated analysis from process to system level was really done for individual industries. So for steel, for ammonia, for plastics, and for what was the remaining one? Now it's trying by head, and for the fuels, of course, for the refining sectors, which are really the reference is there. Manuel Sanchez in Advanced for Applied Energy 2022. This was really high granularity modeling on the industrial side. So we used archetypes, all these technologies are in there. And now this takes a little bit of time, but look what happened. Steel is there. We go to zero carbon or negative. Just the volume stays the same. That's what you see on the left-hand side, but it goes to different technologies. That is a lot of direct reduction with hydrogen. You can do it in different ways. And what do you see on the right-hand side? Cost per ton of steel. It stays almost the same. So the learning curves that we have behind this and that are underpinned allow for that steel production zero carbon. When you do a piece of BECCS, it will even partly be negative, about the same cost. So the ranges there are within the uncertainty range. For plastics, the volume declines because the monomer needs, virgin monomer needs, declines because of circularity. What remains is a mixture of bio-based, circular carbon, and also partly CO2 chemistry. And overall, although the costs increase to some extent on the shorter term, they go down again on the longer term because of the learning curve. So it's another big industry that could be in an attractive economic range, partly delivering negative emissions. Ammonia is interesting because it boosts its production, and that's because of demand for fuels for shipping. Also there, the advanced options also over time can control the cost, etc., etc. So I'm not going to spend any more time. I'm going to.
It's already 22 minutes. I'm sorry.
Yeah. So that's, but just to conclude that those possibilities are there if we plan right. So let me.
Thank you.
Was it?
Thank you.
Minutes?
Thank you. I'm sorry. It's always embarrassing for me to keep the time, but we still have one last question, one last presentation, unless there are any quick questions now, or we keep them after the last presentation. Okay, we can keep them for the last presentation. So the last presentation is an industry perspective, which will be provided by Ennio Prizzi from Bioenergy Europe. So we decided to include also an industry point in this discussion. So Ennio, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me, providing like a very short, I promise, the presentation.
No. I mean, we still have time, and I still
about the future policy framework for carbon removals. I'm Ennio Prizzi. I'm policy officer at Bioenergy Europe. Bioenergy Europe is the European Association for the Bioenergy industry. We are based in Brussels, and we bring together almost 200 members coming from 35 different countries. And basically, we represent the interest of the wide range of different members, coming from raw material producers to power and heat generators. Among the services we offer to our members, you can find EU policy monitoring and influence, and market data, visibility, networking, and much more. And here you can see a list of our members divided in 3 different categories: companies, association, and academia. And we have the pleasure to represent also some front runners in the sector of the negative emission sector, such as Stockholm Exergi or drugs in the BECCS field, but also Syncraft in the field of biochar. Very shortly, our work at Bioenergy Europe for our members, you can find 7 different working groups, basically are decision-making apps in which our members can discuss policy topics, market trends, or new technologies. For example, I coordinate our working group CDR, carbon dioxide removals, in which basically is a forum to explore policy options for the creation of negative emission certificates and incentives within EU energy and climate policies. Well, general context, today I would like to discuss with you about the new Commission proposal on the certification of carbon removals. Basically, general context, back in 2015, 196 different parties agreed on the Paris Agreement. And 4 years later, the European Commission and the European Parliament and the Council adopted the European Green Deal, basically our long-term growth strategy to become climate neutral by 2050. But drastically reduce our emissions won't be enough. So basically, we have to also capture carbon from the atmosphere. And just the combination of these 2 can reach us to the climate neutrality. Basically, it's pretty clear that even if we reduce our emissions, some sector will be hard to abate, in particular agriculture, aviation, and the industry will continue to have some emissions. So we mentioned many times today is the last report from the IPCC is pretty clear that we need carbon removals, and there is a high potential in particular for BECCS. One projections shows that 50% of the needed carbon removal could come from BECCS. And I will go very shortly with this figure is about actually the International Energy Agency scenario. Basically, by 2050, there is a predicted 10% of all bioenergy will use BECCS. So I will discuss about, as I said, the carbon removal certification framework. Basically, we before the Commission proposal adopted back in November 2022, there is the climate law. Basically, the European Parliament and the Council of the European Union adopted in a law, in the European climate law, our objective to reach climate neutrality. And same, the European Commission published the communication on carbon cycles, basically a roadmap to enable carbon removals, with nature-based solutions, so with carbon farming, but also with industrial carbon removals, with different target for different solutions. So as I said, in November 2022, the European Commission published the first EU-wide voluntary framework to certify high-quality carbon removals. Basically, this Commission proposal will boost in new innovation in the carbon removals field, but also for the first time in Europe, we can monitor, verify high-quality carbon removals, and in this way we can provide trust in stakeholders and customers, and in this way we should also avoid greenwashing. In the Commission proposal, we can find 3 different types of carbon removals. Basically, according to the European Commission, carbon can be removed and stored in 3 different ways. So through carbon farming, so for example, restoring forests, soils, and management of wetlands and peatlands, but with permanent storage. So for the first time, the European Commission recognized the potential of bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, but also of DACS, the direct air carbon capture and storage. But also we are referring to carbon storage in long-lasting products and materials such as wood-based construction products, but also according to the last report coming from the European Parliament, we are considering also mineralization in carbon mineralization in products. Important to say that it is out of the scope of the CRCF, the Carbon Removal Certification Framework, both the CCS and CCU, considering that we are speaking about, in this case, of a fossil CO2, while all the carbon removal technologies in the scope of the Commission proposals, we are discussing about biogenic CO2. So, of course, it's out of the scope. In which way we can certify different carbon removal activities? Well, the European Commission is proposing these quality criteria. Basically is an acronym for quantification, additionality, long-term storage, and sustainability. Basically, a certification body can provide with a certification for a certain carbon removal activity just if this carbon removal activity fulfill this quality criteria. So basically a carbon removal activity are measures accurately and deliver benefits for the climate, but in particular sustainability. Carbon removal activities must support the sustainability objectives, or a carbon removal activity should go beyond any law already existent at the national or European level. So how will this work in practices? I don't know if most of you are familiar with the sustainability criteria for biomass and with the verification schemes. Basically, it will work more or less in the same way. So an operator applies to a certification scheme is already approved by the European Commission. An independent certification body carry out periodic audits of the carbon removal activity to verify the compliance with the quality criteria. In case of a positive assessment, it issues a certificate of compliance, and the certification scheme so registers the certificate to certify the net carbon removal benefits generated by a carbon removal activity in a public registry. As you know, we are speaking about a wide range of different carbon removal activities with benefits and also strengths, and so actually it will be impossible to have like one methodology for different carbon removal activities. So for this reason, the European Commission and an expert group will assess different carbon removal methodologies according to each carbon removal activity. Basically, the expert group, we can find 70 members, so independent experts, stakeholders from national authorities, but also trade association, NGOs. And the first kickoff meeting of the expert group was back at the beginning of March. It was pretty clear from the first meeting that the framework itself, so certification criteria and the rules, will be worked by the European Parliament and the Council following the legislative ordinary process, while the European Commission with the expert group will focus just on different methodologies for each carbon removal activity. As you can see here, there is also a timeline. Next week, for example, there will be the meeting of the expert group to assess the methodology for carbon farming, while, of course, at Bioenergy Europe, we are following more BECCS and Biochar. BECCS, of course, is in the industrial removals, so the meeting will be probably end of September, beginning of October. Just quickly, I believe you are familiar with the EU decision-making process, but basically a Commission proposal is the European Commission is in charge to propose, of course, a proposal and to the legislators, the European Parliament and the Council. So basically, speaking about the CRCF, the European Commission adopted a proposal, and now the legislative process is in the hands of the European Parliament and the Council. In the Council, these one of the key players in the European Parliament. Basically, when a political file arrives at the European Parliament, well, the so-called lead committee, the committee in the European Parliament in charge of the file, in this case will be the Environmental Committee. the MV committee, and the lead committee will appoint actually a rapporteur, so a spokesperson for the European Parliament. In this case, is the Lidia Pereira, a Portuguese MEP, part of the EPP political group, and that there will be, of course, an opinion from the Agricultural Committee, in particular for the carbon farming part of the Commission proposal, and an opinion coming from the Industrial Committee in the European Parliament, in particular for the industrial carbon removals activities. General statement coming from Bioenergy Europe. So our position and our opinion on the CRCF, we welcome, of course, the aim of the European Parliament to minimize administrative burdens, developing so a standardized approach for different technologies. We strongly believe that we should separate nature-based solutions and industrial solutions in the CRCF. But still, the purpose of this certification is unclear, because basically, for us, in the European Commission is working other way around. We are assessing different methodologies for each carbon removal activity, but there is no mention to business model or incentives for carbon removal, in particular for industrial carbon removals. For BECCS, for example, in the Commission proposal, they refer just to the Innovation Fund. But as you will know, we are speaking about an industrial activity that needs huge amount of financing to implement. Also, there are several political questions left to the power of the European Commission. Basically, a lot of issues are left to delegated and implementing acts. So we are asking that actually political questions are will follow the legislative processes, so with the European Parliament and the Council. And also we would like to see more coherence and consistency in this year's CF. So in particular, and we will see later when it goes for BECCS and bioenergy production. Actually, we are following, as I said, on biochar and BECCS. In the Article 2 of the Commission proposals, there is a definition for the permanent carbon storage. As I said, BECCS is there, but actually we would like to see also an inclusion of a BCR, of biochar carbon removal, in the definition of permanence. And actually, in the impact assessment of the European Commission with the CRCF, biochar is there. There is an impact assessment in which the permanence of BCR is not under any doubts, but we will see officially BCR in the legislative text. While when it goes to BECCS, so as you will know, often the production of bioenergy is strictly connected with sustainability criteria. And we would like to see, in particular in the Article 7 of the Commission proposal, a consistency between different pieces of legislation. And in particular, we would like to see a specifically mention to the Renewable Energy Directive and Article 29, according to which bioenergy is considered sustainable and our feedstock is considered sustainable. And also in the Article 7, basically, as you can see in the upper part of this slide, the Commission proposal states that the carbon removal activity should have a natural impact or generate co-benefits. We believe that the generation of co-benefits and the natural impact it's perfectly fine for carbon farming. We would like to, for industrial carbon removals, we would like to align with the principle of do not significant harm. So actually we are advocate also for this position. Next step for the legislative text. Last week there was the amendment for the MV in the Environmental Committee. The Environmental Committee will vote actually on a text probably in September, and the position of the Environmental Committee will be voted in the plenary section that will probably be at the middle of October. After the this one basically will be the position of the European Parliament, and after, of course, we will start the interinstitutional negotiations between the three actors involved, so the Commission, Council, and the European Parliament. So probably we will have the final text of this year's CF probably beginning 2025, actually speaking. So I will conclude just a sponsorship of our event. Basically, at the end of November, there will be our annual event in Brussels, the European Bioenergy Future. And of course, we will have several external speakers, and there will be more than one section actually specifically dedicated to the CDR and the carbon removal certification framework. So thank you. I hope I'll be in time.
Thank you. Perfect. Yeah, exactly on time for expected end time.
I try to be really fast. Yeah.
No. And it's always good to have someone who refresh what is happening in the policy framework, because it's so easy to get, I don't know, for me, it's so easy to get lost always. So good to know. We end here, but we still have time for a few questions or discussion if you want. If not, yes. Please speak in the microphone.
Yes, I'm Pablo Millar from Chile, but I'm here studying a master in University of Bologna. But I had a doubt when you talk about you don't have a goal for the policy, but maybe everyone wants a price for the removal of. You can say this now, or of you don't have a goal clear about which is the policy about you want to create about this
for each carbon removal activity, or just
for biomass, because it's for the capture carbon storage. Maybe.
Okay. Are you mean a price, like if we advocate for a specific price, or
maybe sometimes many people is talking about the carbon capture storage for the biomass, for example. Is everyone is talking about this?
No, yes, but of course, our members come from the biomass and bioenergy field, so we advocate, of course, for the inclusion, for the to unlock actually the potential of BECCS in the future years, accordingly, of course, to the different report and scenarios of coming from the European Commission on other agencies. So yes, of course, we are advocate for it. This is part of our job, actually. Yes.
Okay. We have one reaction from Daniela. Hi, Daniela.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, Daniela Train from the German Biomass Research Center. Thank you for the nice presentation. I have only a small question. If you go in this direction of BECCS, do you see more, let's say, these large scale application as drugs, or how intensive you discuss the proposals with biogas or bioethanol?
No more, we are focusing on a large scale, actually. Also is the aim also of the Stockholm Exergi. Okay, they are just a pilot project, but they are aiming to create a large scale district heating in Stockholm. So yes, we are focusing more on a large scale. Also because at Bioenergy Europe, our members come from the solid biomass field. While in Brussels, there is another association, EBA, the European Biogas Association, in which there are members focusing more on the sustainable biogas and biomethane field.
Thank you. Any other reactions? Nixon.
Thanks, Enya. So on the CRCF, could you see it operating like the green taxonomy in Europe, in that, you know, it comes with attractive financing conditions for any private party who's looking to initiate a BECCS project or a biochar project? And I guess just doubling down on that, if you were to have a separate mechanism for industrial removals versus a separate mechanism for, you know, the likes of afforestation or biochar and so on, could you see any kind of financing terms distorting how suppliers would move and maybe, you know, preferentialize BECCS over biochar or vice versa, etc.?
Actually, you know, for when it goes to BECCS, as you see here, that one are actually all the sustainability, the environmental objectives listed in the Article 3 of the taxonomy regulation. So basically, the best option for us is just to connect basically all the different legislation, avoiding to create new layers, for which like new operators should basically fulfill 10 different requirements. So it's better to have one. Okay, the CRCF is perfectly fine for us, just to the certification of carbon removals. But the best option for us is basically a new operator that is like looking for BECCS or for biochar. Okay, I have to fulfill like a criteria, already existing criteria. So fulfill like the production of for BECCS like bioenergies. Okay, Article 29 of the Renewable Energy Directive. In the meantime, Article 3 of taxonomy, the LULUCF criteria, avoided to create new layers and new pieces of legislations. So we are going in this direction, of course. I don't see any preference actually among our members. Sometimes we ask, okay, where when they see the future, we are trying also to mapping new future CDR projects in the biochar and BECCS field, but we don't see any strong preference. Of course, our Nordic members are more for the BECCS, of course. Our Mediterranean members are more for exploring the potential of biochar, indeed. Also there is in the meantime, there was the revision of the Renewable Energy Directive and at the end of financial support for power on installations, but there is a specific exception if you also produce BECCS. Yeah, so we are trying to understand if our members of bioenergy plants will see this as an opportunity for the future. So just to receive a financial support to try to implement the BECCS, but it's something we are understanding. Actually, we are in the process.
Thank you. So we are perfectly on time and ready for the welcome reception, which is about to start in a few minutes. I would like to thank all the speakers and all the participants today. It was really, really unexpected to see so much interaction, and this was really what we were looking forward for. And so I don't know, Kati, you want to have any final thoughts? And we will certainly collect all this feedback, and it will be extremely useful for the final reports of the project. By the way, it's been a very prolific project so far in terms of publications. You can find many publications already from NEGEM on the website. And from my side, thank you. I give last words.
I think I also say just thank you, and please, there are some fact sheets produced by NEGEM available here. So, and please visit our website and contact us if you have any thoughts after the event. But thank you very much for all of you joining us. Thank you.
Thank you. And feel free to continue networking at the welcome reception downstairs. And enjoy the rest of your stay at the EUBCE.